Welcome everybody from the Mekong Club. The Mekong Club is a community of like-minded professionals across different industries working together to address modern slavery risk. This is a program created to help eradicate human trafficking and modern slavery and to strengthen the financial sector's capacity in Australia, New Zealand, and in the Pacific region to address the modern slavery risks in project financing through a human rights due diligence approach. It has been funded by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and is supported by ACAM's Australasia chapter. The program includes 5 online training sessions and 1 bonus online training session and finishes by 1 in-person working group held in Sydney in February 2025. By attending, you will gain an understanding of global slavery issues, trends, and financial sector challenges. You will also have the opportunity to take a confidential voluntary baseline assessment developed at the Mekong Club to evaluate your current modern slavery strategy against industry standards. Additionally, you will have access to exclusive the Mekong Club online tools to upskill team members, improve policies and procedures, enhance informed knowledge sharing, and increase capacity building. Upon completion of the program, by attending 4 out of 6 sessions, participants will receive a certificate of achievement. Your commitment to addressing modern slavery and human trafficking is highly valued. Now, each 60-minute session will feature a 40-minute presentation and 10 minutes Q&A session. We will record the presentation, but we will stop at the time of the question and answers, so you can ask freely any of your questions. And during the presentation, only the presenter will be visible and all the attendees will be muted. And now, without further ado, please let me introduce you to Mr. Matthew Freeman, TMC CEO. Thank you. Matt.
Very good. Thank you for this opportunity. Let me just pull up my slides. What you will be seeing today is what we call our 101 presentation on addressing human trafficking. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to start off with kind of an overview of what is human trafficking, modern slavery. Then I'm going to talk about how this became a private sector issue. How is it that now all of the banks that are attending this is a topic that you're addressing? Why did this come about? How did this come about? Then I'll go specifically into looking at the banks and what banks are doing or not doing, and then have some closing presentation statements. But to begin with, it's really important for us to start off with cases related to this particular topic. So when most people think about human trafficking, they think about the top left-hand photo for good reason. There's 6.3 million women and girls in forced prostitution around the world. My first exposure to this was about 35 years ago. I was living and working in Nepal. I was a public health officer, and my job was to translate resources into healthier people. What we were finding at that time were girls 12, 13 years old who were HIV positive. Couldn't understand what was going on. This is a very conservative culture. So we went to go and interview the women and the girls. What we heard over and over again was pretty much the same story. It went something like this. A human trafficker, guy around 20 years old, would go into a village, flash a bunch of money around and say, I'm looking for a wife. Don't want an urban wife. I want a rural wife. He'd find a girl, befriend her, go to the family and say, I'd like to marry your daughter. They're thinking, wow, he's rich, he's handsome, he's going to take care of our daughter. A couple of days later, they actually have a wedding ceremony. After that, he goes to the family and says, I'm going to take your daughter to Kathmandu, but don't worry, I'll be back in about 3 months. But that isn't what's going to happen. Instead, he takes her to Mumbai, India, to the red light district where the brothels are. When he gets there, he puts her in a room and he says, "Honey, stay here. I'll be right back." As she was coming into this area, she saw all these women dressed funny, these men milling around. She says, "No, no, no, no. Don't leave me. I'm scared." He says, "It's okay. I'll be right back." He goes to the madam to get the 500 US dollars for having sold her to the brothel. He has the gold from the wedding and he hands the wedding pictures over. He then leaves to go back to Nepal to do this again and again, maybe 40, 50 times in the year. The madam then goes into the room where the girl is and says, "Guess what? Her husband just sold you to me, and you're going to be with 20 guys a day every day because I say so." You can imagine her shock. "No, no, no, no. My husband loves me." No, that's what happens. When many of these girls internalize what is going on, they say, "I'll kill myself before I do those shameful things." The madam then brings out the family photos of the wedding and says, "Is this your mother, your father, your brother? If you hurt yourself, we'll hurt them." So she's trapped in this situation. In order to make her into a prostitute, it's quite simple. You shame her. So they bring in a couple of professional rapists, and over a couple of days, they rape this girl maybe 20, 30 times until she just lays back and accepts whatever happens to her. After that, she's put on the line, which means that she will be with 20 guys a day, every day, until after a couple of years, she gets what's called black eye, where she's so depleted physically and emotionally that nobody wants her. So they throw her out onto the street. So I was hearing this story over and over again, but I didn't understand the evil of it until I actually went to those brothels. I was invited by the Indian government to do public health checks. I had a police officer with me. Went into one of the brothels, and there was an 11-year-old trafficking victim. This girl saw this Caucasian guy, saw an opportunity, literally ran up to me and wrapped herself around me and said, "Save me, save me. They're doing terrible things to me." I looked down at this child who was hysterically crying. I turned to the police officer and said, "We need to get this girl out of here." He said, "We can't do that." So, "What are you talking about? You're a police officer." He says, "If we try to leave, we'll both be killed." To make a long story short, we left. We came back with a lot more police, but of course she was gone. Now, I tell this story because I wasn't one of those 15-year-olds that said, when I grow up, I want to be an activist. In fact, I did everything I could not to be. But every once in a while in life, we're tested. This was my big test. I should have gotten that girl out. When I think back to it, I probably could have done 10 different things. After that, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep, and eventually did what a lot of activists do. I surrendered to the fact that now that I know about this, this is what I'm going to do with my life. And 35 years later, here I am talking to you. But it's not just women and girls, it's men and boys. Top right-hand photo is a fishing boat in Thailand. Story behind this is a person from Cambodia is told by the family, "You got to go to Thailand and get a job. We're poor. You need to send money back." He's 15 years old. He goes to Thailand. He's looking for work, not finding it. Human traffickers see this, go up to him and say, "Hey, brother, you're from Cambodia. We're from Cambodia. It looks like you need some help. Let me lend you a little bit of my money." "Okay, well, now that you have my money, you have to stay with me. But guess what? I got this great job. I'm going to take you down to the ocean. I'm going to put you on the boat. The boat's going to go out for a couple of months. You'll catch some fish. You're a guy. Guys love catching fish, right? After that, you'll come back. You'll have lots of money in your pocket. You're going to be a hero to your family." So they go down to the ocean. He gets on the boat. He doesn't realize he's been sold onto the boat. The boat goes out, but it doesn't come back after 3 months. It stays out there for 4 years. This poor kid will end up working 17, 18 hours a day, every day. If he doesn't, he gets beaten. He gets tortured. The only food he'll eat the entire time he's there is rice and fish. Imagine what that does to your body. They often give strong stimulants to get him to work. If he gets injured, if he gets sick, they throw him off the side of the boat. At the end of the 4 years, the boat comes in. Guy goes to the captain and says, "Give me something." Captain says, "Go away. You're illegally in my country." Guy says, "I'll tell the police." Captain laughs and says, "Go ahead. We own the police." Another example of human trafficking. Bottom center photo. I worked in Thailand for the United Nations, and during the time that I was there, we had many cases that came up of forced labor. The case that I'd like to describe happened in a place called Sumit Sakan. This is a location that has about 4,500 seafood packing companies. A person from Myanmar who enters into Thailand because of the violence and the strife and so forth is looking for work, goes down to this location, knocks on one of the doors of the 4,500 seafood packing. Manager comes out and says, "What do you need?" "I'm looking for a job." Manager says, "Okay, I'll give you a job. I'll pay you the equivalent in local currency of 50 US dollars a month. But if you take this job, you can't leave. You have to stay here." This person has never made more than $25, immediately takes the job, goes into the factory, works under, terrible conditions, but at least he's thinking I can send this money home. After a couple of months, he goes to the manager and says, I'd like to be paid. Manager said, well, I forgot to mention one thing. For you to be living in my factory, it cost about 54 US dollars. I'm only paying you 50, not enough to cover that. So guess what? You owe me money and you can't leave until you pay it back. So all the people who are languishing in this factory, every day they work, they get deeper and deeper into debt. Once a month, they would bring one of these people to the back of the factory, beat them until they were bloody, take photographs of it, and then go to the workers and say, if you try to leave, this will happen not only to you, but to your family members. These are all extreme examples of human trafficking, forced labor, modern slavery, whatever we're calling it. But I want to kind of talk a little bit about other forms as well. So I was in Singapore and I did a presentation to a pharmaceutical company. And after I did the presentation, they basically said, well, with all due respect, we're a very sophisticated company. We have, all these systems and procedures in place. We pay our people a lot of money. We don't have to be concerned about this. So I said to them, well, how do you get your product from your warehouse to your pharmacies? Third-party contractors. I asked them if they ever looked into them to see if there's any issues there. They said no. 2 weeks later, we got a call and basically we're told, we looked into this, found out there was a problem. Can you come and provide some help? I went to a law firm in Singapore. Same thing. We're a law firm. We don't have any supply chains. We don't really make things. We have no vulnerability. Who cleans your building? Don't know. They looked into it and 2 weeks later, they came back. Same thing. We found some issues associated with it. So as banks have to be concerned about the suppliers and the organizations that they work with. And so it's not just those extreme cases that I was talking about, it's all different other types of cases. Another topic that we're seeing emerging in Asia is this human trafficking into scam center issue. So what we've seen since COVID is about 250,000 young, educated Asian people have been tricked and deceived into going to Cambodia. And when they get there, they're forced to scam 14, 15 hours a day, every day. If they don't, they get beaten, they get tortured, terrible things happen to them. What this results in is two crimes coming together. One is human trafficking into the scam centers, and the other is the scamming itself. This is an emerging issue. It started off in Cambodia, Myanmar, and Laos. Now we're seeing it in South Asia. We're seeing it in the Middle East. We're seeing it in Africa, Latin America. It's a topic that if you don't know much about it, you really need to look into it because it's something that you have to be concerned about. Okay, so I've been talking about like modern slavery and human trafficking, and I've kind of used them interchangeably, but I'd like to talk about the difference. So when I started doing this work, years and years ago, we didn't have a name for what we're talking about here. Human trafficking hadn't been identified. Now, the reason why they came up with that terminology is that many of the initial cases had a person going from one country to another. And when they got that, they were exploited. So the movement from one place to another equates trafficking. We see drug trafficking. You take the drugs, move them, sell them, arms trafficking, same thing. So the movement was considered to be a relevant part of the process, and that's the reason why they came up with that terminology. But over time, people said, well, wait a minute. We have cases where people go from one country to another. We also have cases where a person goes from one district within a country to another district, or from within the city, one part of the city to the other. What difference does it make how a person got there? Shouldn't we be focusing on the exploitation? So when they were looking for a phrase that included when a person doesn't get paid and they can't leave and there's physical violence and threats and so forth, slavery kept coming up. But because that terminology is usually associated with something that happened years ago, they put the word modern next to it. So human trafficking is kind of the process by which the end point is modern slavery. That'll give you a general sense of it. When it comes to the number of people who are identified to be in this area, it's about 50 million. In fact, there are more modern slaves than there are Australians or Canadians. In fact, according to the United Nations, there's more modern slaves now than any other time in history. When it comes to where many of them are, it's in Asia, basically for two reasons. Number one, there's a lot of people in Asia. China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.4 billion people. Then you take Japan and the Philippines and all these other countries that have huge populations. The other thing is that The feudal systems that exist in this part of the world have never been completely dismantled. So go to Beijing, very modern city, go 20 kilometers outside, and you find exploitative systems that have been in place for a long, long time. They have never changed. Now, COVID basically changed this number from 40 million to 50 million. The reason for that really comes down to desperation and debt. So let's say that you're a Bangladeshi worker and this is prior to COVID and you're working in a factory and you're supporting 5, 6 people. All of a sudden, COVID hits. What happens? Your factory closes not for a couple of days or weeks or months, but for years. In order to survive, you borrow money. You can't pay that back. And money lenders come and say, well, if you can't pay it back, you need a family member. They're going to go off to a boat. They're going to end up in a sweatshop or someplace else. And so as a result of that desperation, you see significant increases in modern slavery. The rate at which people enter is about 9.2 million people per year. That translates to about 25,200 per day. In the time it takes me to do this presentation, about 1,000 people somewhere in the world will be entering into modern slavery or a new slave every 4 seconds. So if we count to 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, somewhere in the world, somebody is entering into modern slavery, and the drum beats on and on and on. Now, if I was in front of an audience where I could see you, I would go to one of the audience and participants and say, I'm going to offer you a job. And this is the job that I would say. I'm going to offer you a job that pays 1 million US dollars a year. You only have to work 4 days a week. I'll give you 2 hours off for lunch. I'll give you a house, a car, 3 months of vacation. You can live anywhere in the world you want. Are you interested? Now, most people, when they hear that, would say, yeah, that sounds like a good job. But at the same time, in the back of their mind, they're saying, well, this sounds too good to be true. And in fact, in many cases, if this type of job was offered, it would be too good to be true. But imagine if you're a rickshaw wallet, the person who rides the rickshaw and takes people around, and you make about 5 US dollars a day, and you're never going to make more than that. But somebody comes to you and says, how would you like to make 10 US dollars a day? And instead of working 16 and a half hours, you only have to work 14 hours, and I'll give you 2 hours off on Sunday. But in order to get that job, you have to make the decision right now. You can't go home. Maybe the person is thinking, sounds too good to be true. But what if it isn't? What if it's true? I can get that house, roof that I need. I can get a motorcycle. And so a lot of people are tricked and deceived into this kind of wonderful offer that they're given that is fraudulent and deceptive. Another thing is debt. So let's say that you're in Hong Kong and you need an operation and you need 1,000 Hong Kong dollars. You don't have it. You can't get it from the bank. You go off to a money lender. You borrow that money. The operation takes place. It's successful. You go to the money lender and you try to give them 1,500 back with interest. 1,500? I need 5,000. Well, you say, well, this isn't fair. The money lender doesn't have to be fair. They're criminals. They make up what these things are. So that fraudulent indebtedness that happens often ties person to another individual and is an indicator of modern slavery. Lastly is kidnapping. Most people think that kidnapping is a big part of modern slavery. It doesn't really happen very often because if a person doesn't want to go with somebody else, they kick, they scream, they make noise, it's dangerous. Somebody could see it, call the police. So deception represents probably the 85% of what we see, with debt being associated with that. When it comes to the age distribution, about a quarter of the cases would be children, the rest would be adults. Most people think that human trafficking is predominantly forced prostitution. It only represents about a quarter of the cases. But this is where it comes back to us. 82% of the forced labor cases, which represents a lion's share of what we're talking about, are associated with supply chains, where we get our fish and our electronics and our food and so forth. And so we as consumers buy things, and a percentage of what we buy is tainted by modern slavery. This is an important point because by us buying things that are tainted by modern slavery, we're contributing to the problem. I'll come back to this point a little bit later. So who's supposed to be addressing this issue? Well, it's supposed to be governments. And there are a lot of governments that make an attempt to address this, but there's also a lot of governments that really don't like this issue. It's embarrassing to have slaves. They don't know what to do with them. They don't know how to address their needs. They don't want them to stay in their country. And so governments do things, but often not enough to really make a significant difference. I worked for the United Nations for 6 years. I'll put my hand on my heart when I say this. I believe in the United Nations system. But I spent a lot of time in 5-star hotels eating really good food, debating and discussing the theoretical aspects of human trafficking. We weren't close enough to the action to really make much of a difference. So it's the NGOs that are doing most of the work. They are the ones that do the prevention and the prosecution and everything else. But if we go back to the statistics, if 82% of what we're dealing with in forced labor is associated with supply chains, who else has to be associated with this? Private sector. But if you think governments don't like this topic, the private sector dislikes it even more because they're often on the receiving end of somebody wagging a finger and saying, it's because of your greed, your desire for shareholder profits. You would knowingly use slave labor for profits. Now, in reality, that's not the case. Branded companies around the world will do anything and everything they can to avoid exploitation, but this is what consumers believe. And I'll come back to that point a little bit later as well. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is the number of people who have been saved out of human trafficking last year out of 50 million. And then I'm going to show you out of 500,000 criminals, what percentage of them basically went to jail and were convicted of these crimes. So with all the United Nations and the NGOs and the governments combined, these are the results. Last year, out of 50 million people, about 108,000 people, 0.2% of the victims. Out of 500,000 criminals, about 6,000 or 0.8% were convicted. Wow, when you look at this, you might ask the question, does the counter-trafficking world not care? Are we lazy? Are we not doing what we should be doing? That's not the issue. Anyone who works in human trafficking desperately wants to make a difference. We're all committed to making a difference. The issue is this. The profits generated from modern slavery are excessive, 236 billion US dollars a year. The amount of money that's available to fight this is about 350 million or 0.13%. Huge profits, little bit of money available to address this. To put that number into perspective, in the United States, we eat a lot of potato chips, 6 billion US dollars a year. It takes 21 days of potato chip eating in the United States to come up with the equivalent amount of money that is used to fight modern slavery. You can see what it is we're up against. Another thing is the scale. The number of people like me around the world that do this is about 30,000. You have to follow rules and regulations and rule of law and get progress reports and donor money and so forth. If you're a criminal, you don't have to do any of those things. If somebody comes after that, you mutate, you change, you evolve, you hurt somebody, obviously an unfair advantage. And lastly, awareness. Usually, again, if I'm in front of an audience, I ask the audience, what percentage of you, or how many of you knew 25% of what I was talking about today before I said it? And usually I don't get more than a hand or two, sometimes no hands. If you don't know about an issue, you're not going to care. If you don't care, you're not going to do anything. So awareness is an extremely important part of the process, which is why we do these presentations. It's not your fault that you don't know this. We, the counter-trafficking world, have to do a better job of sensitizing and promoting this information. Okay, so now I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to talk about the private sector. Why is it this issue that was very much a part of the NGO and the United Nations government world is now being discussed in a banking forum? And the reason for that really comes down to a couple of things. The first thing is that 0.2% of the victims being helped figure. When governments and regulators came to realize that the NGOs and everybody else weren't having much of an impact, but at the same time, you saw this nexus between this issue in supply chains and financial institutions and so forth. They said, well, we got to bring the private sector into this. But because they felt like the only way to do that was to create some kind of a business risk, many of the things that we see are basically geared towards incentivizing the private sector and the banks and so forth to get involved, because if you don't, something bad may happen. So let's talk about some of the trends associated with this. The first trend was legislation. So prior to 2012, when it comes to human rights and human trafficking and so forth, organizations would get together, the governments, the United Nations, and sometimes corporations to debate and discuss and talk about human rights, talk about human trafficking. It often resulted in white papers and guidelines and so forth. And these documents are excellent. They're very good resources, but they're not legally binding. The first legislation specifically related to corporations and brands came out of California, the California Transparency and Supply Chain Act in 2012. This was put in place by the Terminator Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was governor at that time and signed this legislation into action. The California Transparency and Supply Chain Act basically says if you're a big company and you have $100 million in retail or manufacturing and you have a single product in California, you have to put on your website what you're doing to address modern slavery. If you're not doing anything at all and you say that, you're in compliance, but you have to say something. So if you're a Japanese company and you have products in California, you got to do this. It's got to be in. So this legislation is really unique because it forces companies all over the world to basically be transparent related to this. And they call it transparency legislation because it allows for consumers to see what companies are doing or not doing. A couple of years later, the UK government did their legislation, which lowered it from 100 million US dollars to 36 million pounds, but they added two additional things. One was an annual report. It's usually about 20 pages that describes what they do related to addressing modern slavery, and that has to be signed by the board of directors. Then you have the Duty of Vigilance Act in France. You have the Australian Act, the German, the Canadian Act. With each of these additional acts, they add additional bells and whistles. For example, the Australian Act basically ensures that you have a repository so people can determine, what's happening with companies. The German Act has a grievance mechanism built into it that forces companies to look at this all the way down to the lowest level of their supply chain. The Canadian Act has fines and penalties associated with forced labor that's identified within supply chains and so forth. And so as a result of these things, it incentivizes companies to kind of understand what they need to do in order to address this. A certain number of individuals on this call would fall under this legislation that I'm talking about now. Another thing would be lawsuits against major corporations. So in some cases, like let's say there's a retailer from North America and they want to buy seafood from Thailand, they're being sued. And what the plaintiffs are saying is that by you basically buying from Thailand, for which we know that there's modern slavery, you're contributing to modern slavery. Now, interestingly, these cases often don't get won, but the cases get discussed in social media and regular media, and as a result of this results in naming and shaming, reputational risk. The chocolate industry is often sued because within different parts of Africa, you have children that are in forced labor circumstances. And so this association with modern slavery and chocolate creates a real problem for companies. If you're a chocolate company, you don't want your product to be associated with modern slavery. You want it to be associated with Valentine's Day and birthdays and Easter and various other holidays related to that. And so these situations with lawsuits and the media coverage associated with it can create real problems. And to add to this, the media coverage related to modern slavery continues to grow. And for a long time, it was doubling every year in terms of the articles and exposés that you would find in the various forms of media. Now, the interesting thing about media is the more coverage you have, the more there's an appetite for additional coverage. Now, in the 1990s, HIV/AIDS was the topic of interest. And for 10 years, you saw media coverage of that. When was the last time you saw an article on HIV/AIDS? Not for a long time. The issue hasn't gotten any better, but it moved on to another issue, which was with climate change and global warming. For 15 years, it dominated the scenes. The new emerging issue that's getting a lot of attention is modern slavery. So you'll expect to see more and more coverage of that over time. Then there's the aspect of ESG. Now, ESG prior to COVID, we all know ESG is the metric that is used by the private sector to determine how they're relating to the environment. So that's the E, governance, how you basically structure your organization with your boards and your governance and so forth. And S is where modern slavery is. Now, prior to COVID, you would see a lot of companies that would cherry pick which of these indicators that they wanted to give back to the investors and the consumers. So let's say that you're an electric car company and you basically spend a lot of time focusing on the E indicators because you're green, you're not using fossil fuels in the governance side, but you don't pay much attention to the S. Post-COVID, because there has been this sense of trying to determine the extent to which companies are doing good, what we're hearing is that there's more talk about regulating ESG. So I was in Ottawa and I spoke to senators and parliamentarians. I was in Washington, D.C. I spoke to senators and congressional people and so forth. And as a result of that process, They were saying that ESG should be standardized. If you're a company and you fall into a particular category, everyone should basically be looking at indicators of E, S, and G. So that car company that was electric, that was picking between the E and the G, if they have to put the S in there, they have a problem. Why? Because the lithium and the cobalt that's used for their car batteries comes from often the Congo. And there's a lot of exploitation associated with this. So this becomes an incentive for companies to make sure that they don't have this type of exploitation in their supply chains. And the reason why this is relevant and important is that millennials care about this. There was a recent survey in the United States that said that 84% of millennials care about ESG scores and they look at it. These same individuals are eventually going to be the fund managers for the retirement funds and the mutual funds and so forth, and they will carry their values into this management process. And so these all factors basically contribute to the process by which companies feel like they have to step up and get in more involved. This isn't just banks, this includes everybody. But what you see is this trend to look into, to explore, to identify, to know where within your supply chain and your business there are issues and problems that you have to address. Okay, so now let's switch over to banks themselves. Why should banks care about this? Well, because if they don't, bad things can happen. I'm not going to get into the details of it, but there have been banks that have been fined and penalized related to this particular topic. They allowed for certain things to take place, and as a result of that, they got a big fine. Now, the fines are sometimes, in one particular case, it's over $1 billion, but that's not really as much of an issue. The issue is that the reputational risk of a particular organization that has a stellar reputation, but all of a sudden they find themselves in a situation where, modern slavery is associated with that, that can have a devastating impact on that. So if we're talking about $236 billion that's generated from modern slavery, and this is up from 150 8 months ago to 236 because they recalculated it. In fact, there may be people on this call who have heard that the number is even higher than that. There's other estimates that have it closer to $500 billion. If we're talking about that much money, it has to go somewhere. A lot of this is within legitimate banks. Now, obviously, if illegitimate money gets into a legitimate bank, it's money laundering. And that's why the banks are very interested in addressing this, because if they don't, again, fines and penalties, reputational risk, naming and shaming, loss of investment, et cetera, et cetera. So they have to be concerned about this. They have to be looking at this. And so we see that the banking community, the financial transaction community is spending a lot of time trying to figure out what they need to do in order to preempt any direct association with this. And so, these are the typical things that banks do. But there's some additional things that are happening as well. And so there's like 6 categories that we're seeing. Obviously, typologies are being developed in order to address these types of things. Typologies are used to identify the red flags so that forensic accounting can take. Once you have these packages of red flag indicators, you can put it up against your big data. But another thing that we're seeing is that there's more communication between the financial institutions and NGOs. Our organization is a non-government organization. We work with banks all the time. And there are other organizations that do similar things. We're seeing more partnerships with law enforcement. And this is related to law enforcement kind of gets what the bad guys are out there doing. And that information allows for the banks to identify typologies and so forth. And lastly, World Check and World Compliance basically have received information from organizations that were collecting information from publicly available information. So let me go into this in a little bit more detail. Obviously, since this is a banking community, you guys know what typologies are. This is a typology for sex trafficking. On the top, you see the perpetrator and the victim and the various kind of stages at which a person goes from being recruited to ending up in a sex trafficking situation. And, then below you see different transactions that take place that would be perceived as being potentially nefarious. Now, a lot of them are just regular transactions, and some of them they have a red flag because if you compile them together, the pattern gives you a general sense of maybe you have an issue or a problem. So to give you a sense of this, Actually, before I do that, I just want to say that the Mekong Club has a number of typology reports related to human trafficking. They're available. We'll see that this community has access to them. One was done with Thomson Reuters and the Mekong Club. The other two were done with support from the banking community, and we will continue to update these over time. But let's go back to the typologies. And let me give you an example that is often used to just illustrate what I'm talking about. So, in terms of forensic accounting, in the United States, there was a nail salon parlor that was run by Vietnamese groups. And the nail salon parlors had office hours from 9 in the morning till 9 o'clock at night. But an accountant found that there were transactions taking place 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, all around 200 US dollars, and couldn't understand what was going on. And so they looked into it and they came to realize that there was a sex trafficking ring being run in that same location. So in this particular case, the red flag indicators would be transactions taking place after hours in a particular type of business around 200 US dollars or more. And so they would package that and they would use this to see within their data they have other things. Forensic accounting could be used in other ways. For example, we do a fair amount of training of frontline bankers. And, I recently did something in Bangladesh, and initially the bankers said, well, we don't have any issues related to this. And even if we did, we wouldn't see it. So I asked them questions. Well, do you ever see a person come in with a bunch of individuals and take their passports and go and get accounts for them? And in addition to having their own name on it, that person's name is, and at the same time, that person is controlling a bunch of people. And when you try to go and talk to the others, this person basically says, no, you should be talking to me. There are certain indicators that are out there related to this. Some of these are the same type of indicators you would find for other money laundering situations. Some of them are specific for human trafficking. And over time, what we're beginning to see is certain patterns to make it easier for us to identify what these patterns are. And that's why these typology reports and red flags are important. Because once again, once you have these red flags, you can then take your big data and you can run scenarios to see whether or not you see these patterns. Now, obviously, you're going to get a lot of false positives as part of this process, but with kind of identifying suspicious type of behavior and then kind of playing around with data and so forth, eventually this results in more suspicious transaction reports being sent out. And then within the banking community, perhaps more sharing of these indicators and these red flag indicators to allow for the community of financial institutions to be able to address these things. And that's part of what we're trying to move in the direction of seeing take place. Why work with the NGOs? Well, the NGOs have information on how traffickers work, where they are, migration patterns. They have all kinds of information. And so if you're able to interview and collect information from the survivors who have been in these situations, you can develop your typologies. You can refine them. You can improve them. You can identify what patterns exist and so forth. And so this is an extremely important part of the process, is to be able to collect this type of information. It's the same with law enforcement. You're seeing, for example, I'm just giving two examples. The state of New York had the Attorney General bring the financial community together. They talked about human trafficking and indicators and how information could be shared. Microsoft and Google and other large organizations have also kind of stepped up and brought law enforcement and financial community together. These two communities in the past haven't really gotten along. They have a different way of looking at the world, but if you can bridge the communication gap and allow for anonymized information from the banks to be given to law enforcement so they can give their interpretation, and for the banks to be able to provide or the law enforcement to give information to the banking community to develop typologies and so forth, this becomes a win-win for everybody. And so we're seeing this trend take place not only in North America, but here in Asia as well. Another thing is about 12 years ago, some NGOs got together and said, okay, well, why don't we collect information related to human trafficking? Because WorldCheck and World Compliance didn't have that information. And so this was sent off to Reuters and to LexisNexis. And as a result of that, you have a lot of these cases that are now within these databases. So if you want to onboard a client, whether it's an individual or a company, you can search and see if they come up. this is another addition that we're seeing over time. And so these are just a couple of examples of what we're seeing related to modern slavery and the financial institution and the direction they're going in. So what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about the Mekong Club. We're an organization that's based in Hong Kong. We work with the private sector in a positive, supportive, non-naming and shaming way. We have a kind of an unusual name. Why would you call this type of an organization the Mekong Club? And part of the reason why we did it is because the name doesn't mean anything. When we were setting up this organization, our private sector partners basically said, if you put human rights and human trafficking in the title, it'll scare the private sector away. People will ask, are you using this organization because you have a problem? And so we worked initially in Southeast Asia where the Mekong River was. We put club, and so we basically came up with this name. We work with the banking institutions across Asia and the world, manufacturing, retail. It's pretty clear why banks and manufacturers and retailers would be interested in it. Why the hotels? Well, they have four vulnerabilities. Number one, they have construction. Number two, they have seafood and other supply chain potential exploited type products that they buy. They have contractors that are brought in order to work within their facilities. Sometimes they can be exploited. And lastly, sex trafficking. And so all of these things basically result in the private sector recognizing and needing to understand what this issue is. So one of the things we do is we start off with a baseline. We basically identify where a company is in their journey related to addressing modern slavery. And then based on this, we give them, out of a score of 100, let's say they get 50, the prescription of what you need to do in order to address this and how you address it and so forth. We also develop tools. Our various working groups that include finance and supply chains and hospitality meet on a quarterly basis. And during the time we meet, we debate and discuss and identify things that need to be done in order to address modern slavery. One of the things that one of the working groups said is that we need e-learning. And so we looked at e-learning and came to realize that a lot of people don't like it. 45 minutes of content and you got to take an exam at the end. And so rather than 45 minutes of content, we have 15 3-minute videos, but we have the videos in multiple languages. And the reason for that is that 90% of the information related to human trafficking is usually in English, but 90% of the people who really need it often speak other languages. So the videos are in multiple languages here in Asia and around the world. And we do that based on making sure that we accommodate the needs of the people who need the information. Another one of the tools that we've developed was called the Apprise app. Our manufacturing group said, well, we need an app so that if an auditor is in a factory and he goes onto the factory floor and all these people from different countries, how do you communicate with them? So what the app does is it basically has flags on the front and you get the person to press the flag from where they come from. And then with headphones on in their language, the phone will say, we're going to ask you some questions. The answer to the question is yes, press green, no, press red. Are you here against your will? Do you have access to your passport? Do you need help, et cetera, et cetera? By allowing this tool to be in place, it's significantly increased victim identification within different locations. So we have about 37 tools that we use based on this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to switch gears and talk a little bit about this topic as an activist. So as I mentioned, I've been working on this for over 35 years, and I'm deeply committed to wanting to make this issue go away, recognizing that we're having very little impact at all. And so in my early days, I decided in order to contribute to this, I was going to write a book. So I decided as part of this book process, I would go around to the shelters in Nepal where I was working and interview the sex trafficking victims. So I went to one shelter, and then when I got there, there was a girl named Geeta, and every time I approached her for an interview, she said, no, 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 I don't want to give it. But as I interviewed everyone else, she sat right next to me and listened to all of the interviews. I collected all the information. I was about to leave that shelter, and as I was walking out, Geeta comes running up and says, I changed my mind. You can have my interview. So she sat on one side of the table. The rest of us sat on the other side of the table. And over a 3-hour period, she told the worst story I'd ever heard of rape and torture and disease. And honestly, I didn't know what to say to this young person. It was just so bad. I had heard a lot of cases. I was shut down. I didn't have anything to say. Finally, I turned to her and I said, wow, Geeta, you must be so angry at those traffickers for the horrific things they did to you. She paused. Then she said, "No, I'm angry at you and you and you." She pointed at us. She said, "Where were you?" Said that every single day she woke up praying for somebody to come and help. Nobody came. Said she went to school till she was 12. She knew that everything in front of these brothels was right out in the open. It was illegal. Nobody was doing anything. She said she wasn't angry at the traffickers. See, she said they're just bad people being bad people. That's what bad people do. She said she was angry at the good people, at society for allowing a 15-year-old girl to be commercially raped 7,000 times only to eventually get AIDS and she was dying. Now, I tell the story because Gita inherently understood that the people like me, the 30,000 of us, is insufficient to be able to make even a 0.5%. In order for this to go away, we as human beings have to step up and get involved and do whatever it is that's needed in order to make a difference. So I often say to my audiences, if I could get each of you to do one thing a year related to this topic, that's 1 times 39. That would add up. And you might ask, well, what can you do? Well, one thing you can do is learn about the issue. Guess what? You just did your one thing. How easy was that? But if you go and tell another person, or if you share this information with your family, or if you see an article and you put it on LinkedIn, you've done another thing and another thing and another thing. If we are able to basically move forward in order to address this particular type of issue, with large numbers of people stepping up and getting involved, that would really make a difference. Another thing you can do is to be a responsible consumer. Before you buy a branded product, what you can do is basically go online to see whether or not that product company has a policy. If they do, congratulate them. If they don't, say, listen, I like your products. I'd feel better if you have it. It can be done in a very respectful way. You can volunteer. My youngest volunteer was 9 years old. This girl saw me in a documentary. She approached me and basically said, "Mr. Friedman, human trafficking is terrible. I want to help." I said, "You're 9 years old?" She said, "So what?" I said, "You're 9 years old, 9 years old." She said, "9-year-olds are the new 16-year-olds. Give me a chance." So I asked her what she could do. Said she could find anything on the internet. So I had a couple of Ivy League second-year law people. I gave them an assignment. They couldn't find it. I gave it to this young girl. 2 days later, everything that I needed was there, because that was her God-given gift. That was her inherent, gift, that she was gifted at finding things. We all have gifts, whether it's public speaking or communicating or writing or selling t-shirts. It doesn't matter. You apply that to volunteerism, it makes a difference. Another thing is basically when it comes to fundraising or donating, a lot of organizations didn't survive COVID. They just didn't make it. And so at this particular time, the funding that is needed for NGOs doing this work, skip a meal, find a local organization, donate it to them. It makes all the difference. Okay, so I have just a couple of more things that I want to say, and then I'll finish. And this is based on another story, and it relates to the banking community. So I was in Washington, D.C. right before COVID at the American Banking Association. I did a big presentation. This person came up to me afterwards and said, I want to tell you a story. As a public speaker, this happens on a regular basis. So I said, go ahead. He said he was taking his wife and teenage daughter from one part of the United States to the other. They were driving. They got to the halfway point. They pulled into a motel. He got his wife and daughter settled. And as he was leaving, he saw this 14-year-old girl being pulled into a room. He thought it had something to do with prostitution. He had a teenage daughter. It bothered him. So he went to the manager of the motel and said, I saw this. There's a problem. He then went back to his room and he's peeking through the curtains to see if anything will happen. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, the police come. 15 minutes after that, this guy's being taken out in handcuffs. The girl's basically being taken away in an unmarked car, presumably to a shelter. He said, this was a milestone in my life. I feel so proud of the fact that I did this. So I looked at the guy and I said, well, what do you do? He said, well, I'm a banker. I said, yeah, you're at a banking conference. I get that. What do you do? Says I'm an anti-money laundering person, fraud, corruption person. I asked him if he ran human trafficking suspicious transactions reports. He said, yeah, we get those on a periodic basis. So I looked at this guy and I said, dude, don't you realize that by you submitting that, somebody on the other side might be eventually doing a raid and rescue, helping these people? You have been contributing to this all along. You're heroic. The work that you do is heroic. You're protecting your organization, but at the same time, you're making the world a better place. It took him a few minutes to get his head around to that, but then he said, yeah, I guess you're right. I don't really get much, positive feedback on my job, but you're right. What we do makes a difference. So a couple of months later, I'm in Singapore. I get in front of this big audience and all bankers, and many of them were analysts and risk assessment people and so forth. I told them that story. And I said, you guys are heroes. By you protecting your organization, you make the world a better place. I must have had 20 people come back afterwards. And I say this because I think that there are a lot of people who do work that's related to addressing issues like human trafficking. They don't get credit for it. I think in some cases, the private sector does even more than the NGOs, and you should be lauded for that type of activity. There are a couple of books that we sell in order to raise money to address the issues that we have. One is on volunteerism. The other one is a manuscript that looks at modern slavery that gives you all the information that you need. I'm also on LinkedIn if anyone's interested. Any information you want about the Mekong Club, let us know. We'll give it to you. Thank you very much. And I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.